The merciless sun bore down on Dust Valley, like a blacksmith's hammer striking red-hot iron, transforming the hard-pan earth into a cracked mosaic of desperation. The sound that shattered the afternoon stillness wasn't the whisper of wind through sagebrush or the distant cry of a hawk. It was the metallic click of a rifle being cocked, followed by Eli McBride's gravelly voice cutting through the heat-shimmered air. "I said, show yourselves, or I start shooting." From behind the weathered feed crates near his ranch house, 6 figures emerged like mirages materializing from a fever dream. But these weren't the clean-faced decoys that con artists sometimes used. These were genuine phantoms of starvation, their hollow eyes reflecting 14 months of relentless drought that had turned fertile grazing land into a wasteland where only the most stubborn weeds survived. Eli's calloused finger tightened on the trigger of his Winchester as he studied the children before him. At 43, he'd learned that in Dust Valley, unexpected visitors usually meant one of 3 things: outlaws, desperate folks turned to banditry, or death riding in on horseback. The fact that these were children didn't ease his suspicion. He'd heard tales of youngsters used as bait, while armed adults lurked nearby. The oldest of the group, a boy with dark hair plastered to his skull, and eyes that had witnessed too much brutality for someone so young, stepped forward with the careful movements of a person who'd learned to expect violence from every adult encounter. "Please don't shoot, mister," the boy said, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "We ain't here to rob you. We're just so hungry we can't walk much further." Eli's weathered face remained impassive as he took in the details that would tell him whether these children were genuine or part of some elaborate scheme. Their clothes hung in tatters patched with scraps of different fabrics that spoke of desperate resourcefulness. Their bare feet were cut and bleeding from walking across rough terrain, and their faces bore the gaunt hollows of prolonged malnutrition. The youngest, a girl with tangled blonde hair and enormous blue eyes, swayed on her feet, as if a strong breeze might topple her. Another boy, maybe 7 years old, had a fresh cut across his left cheek that had scabbed over without proper cleaning. Their collective desperation was too genuine to be manufactured, their fear too real to be performance. "What are your names?" Eli asked, his rifle still trained on them, but his voice gentling slightly. "I'm Jesse Whitmore." The oldest boy replied, his chin lifted with fragile pride. "This here's my sister Annie, she's 10. That's Tommy, he's 7. Beth's 9, Carl's 6, and little Rose just turned 5 last month." He gestured to each child in turn, his protective instincts evident in how he positioned himself between them and the armed stranger. As Jesse spoke, Eli noticed something that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. The boy's stance, feet planted, wide shoulders squared, despite his obvious weakness, reminded him painfully of his own son Samuel at that age. Samuel had stood the same way when defending his pet chicken from a neighbor's dog, all courage and determination despite being hopelessly outmatched. "You said Whitmore," Eli said, lowering his rifle slightly. Something about the name stirred a memory he couldn't quite grasp. "Where you from?" "Nowhere special," Jesse replied carefully. "Our parents died of the fever last year. We've been taking care of ourselves since then." Annie, the girl with the piercing blue eyes, spoke up for the first time. "We escaped from bad men 3 days ago. They made us work in dark places underground, barely fed us, kept us chained at night." Her voice was steady, but Eli could see the tremor in her small hands. "What kind of work?" Eli asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Mining," Tommy said, his young voice filled with bitter knowledge. "Diggin' for gold and silver in places where grown men won't work 'cause it's too dangerous. If the tunnels collapsed or we got hurt, they'd just find more kids to replace us." Eli's jaw clenched. Child labor in illegal mining operations was one of the most despicable crimes imaginable, and hearing about it from these young voices made his blood boil. "Who ran this operation?" "A man named Clyde Beasley," Jesse said, and Eli felt his blood turn to ice water. You heard of him. Eli had indeed heard of Beasley, a brutal overseer, who operated outside the law, moving his operations from territory to territory before local authorities could catch up. The man was known for his complete lack of conscience and his willingness to treat human beings as expendable resources. I know the name, Eli said grimly. How'd you get away? Beth, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. At 9 years old, she had the serious expression of someone who'd been forced to grow up too fast. Jesse picked the locks with a piece of wire he found. We waited until the guards were drinking whiskey around their campfire, then snuck out during the night. We've been walking ever since. Carl added, his 6-year-old voice filled with exhaustion. Hiding during the day, traveling at night. We're real good at being quiet. Little Rose, who had been clinging to Annie's torn dress, looked up at Eli with eyes that held depths of sadness no child should possess. The bad man said he was going to sell us to other bad men who would take us far away. That's why we had to run. The matter-of-fact way she said it made Eli's stomach turn. These children had lived with the constant threat of violence, and exploitation had accepted it as normal. Just like his Samuel had learned to duck when riders approached their property, these kids had learned to hide when adults appeared. Eli studied the group more carefully, noting how they stood clustered together like a pack of wolves. The older ones kept the younger ones shielded, and even little Rose, despite her obvious exhaustion, kept one small hand wrapped around Annie's skirt. Their loyalty to each other was evident in every gesture, every protective glance. You said you're hungry, Eli said finally. When's the last time you ate? Yesterday morning, Jesse replied. Found some wild berries and caught a rabbit, but it wasn't much split 6 ways. Eli looked at the simple meal he'd prepared for himself, a thick slab of roast beef beans swimming in their own juice, and a heel of bread still warm from the cast-iron oven. It represented most of his remaining food stores, carefully rationed to last through the continuing drought. But looking at these children, these walking embodiments of everything brutal and unfair about the world, he found himself unable to take even a single bite. Sit down, he said gruffly, gesturing toward the porch steps. All of you, you can have the food. The children's faces transformed with relief, so profound, it was almost painful to witness. They settled onto the wooden steps with the careful movements of people who'd learned not to trust good fortune too quickly. Jesse made sure the youngest ones got the largest portions, cutting the meat into manageable pieces with a pocket knife that had seen better days. As they ate with desperate hunger, trying to maintain some semblance of table manners despite their obvious starvation, Eli found himself thinking about the past. 5 years ago, he'd been a different man, a husband who sang while he worked, a father who carved wooden toys for his son. But consumption had taken his wife Mary with brutal efficiency. And 3 years later, a stray bullet from a passing outlaw had claimed Samuel's life. The boy had been feeding chickens in the yard when the shot rang out, a meaningless death that had hollowed Eli out like a scraped gourd. Mr. Jesse said between bites, "We heard you lived alone out here. Figured a man who keeps to himself might not turn us in for the reward money." "Because there's a reward?" Eli asked, though he suspected the answer. $20 for each of us," Annie said with the casual tone of someone who'd grown accustomed to having a price on her head. "Dead or alive? Beasley don't much care which." The words hit Eli like a physical blow. These children, these babies, had bounties on their heads, like common criminals. The injustice of it made him want to put his fist through the nearest wall. "You don't have to worry about that," he said quietly. "I'm not turning anybody in." As the children continued eating, Eli noticed details that spoke to their individual personalities. Jesse ate quickly but efficiently, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. Annie was more deliberate, making sure each bite counted and occasionally slipping extra food to little Rose. Tommy had a nervous habit of touching the cut on his cheek as if reassuring himself it was healing. Beth ate with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned to consume food as fuel rather than pleasure. Carl seemed to be fighting sleep, his eyelids drooping even as he chewed. And Rose ate with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a child who'd temporarily forgotten her troubles. "Tell me about Beasley," Eli said. "What kind of man is he?" Jesse's expression darkened. "The worst kind. He's bigger than you even. Got gray hair and eyes like a dead fish. He don't just hurt people for business, he enjoys it. I seen him beat a boy near to death just for dropping a pickaxe. He's got 2 men with him most times," Annie added. "One's thin and mean, always chewing tobacco. The other's got a scar across his face from here to here." She traced a line from her left temple to her right jaw. "They both carry guns and know how to use them." Tommy looked up from his food, his young face serious. "Beasley said we belonged to him. Said he fed us and housed us, so we were his property until he decided different." The words made Eli's vision blur with rage. No child should have to hear such things, much less accept them as truth. "You don't belong to anybody," he said firmly. "You're free people, every one of you." "Don't feel free," Beth said quietly. "Feel like we're always going to be running." Before Eli could respond, the sound he'd been dreading echoed across the valley, the distant crack of a rifle shot, followed by the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. The children's heads snapped up in unison, their faces draining of color as they recognized the sound of their worst nightmare becoming reality. "He found us," Jesse whispered, his voice filled with the kind of terror that only comes from experience. Through the shimmering heat waves rising from the baked earth, Eli could see a dust cloud approaching from the southeast. 3 riders were coming hard, their horses' hooves pounding against the hardpan with the relentless rhythm of an approaching storm. Even from a distance, he could make out the massive frame of the lead rider, and the way he sat his horse like a man who'd never encountered an obstacle he couldn't crush through sheer brutality. "Get inside," Eli commanded, his survival instincts overriding his confusion. "All of you right now." The children scrambled through the front door like startled rabbits, their brief moment of safety shattered by the approach of their tormentor. Eli grabbed his Winchester and checked the chamber, his hand steadier now that he had a clear enemy to face. The riders thundered into the homestead, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of alkaline dust that burned the eyes and throat. Clyde Beasley was exactly as the children had described, a mountain of a man, with graying hair and eyes like chips of obsidian. His face was weathered and scarred with a kind of cruel mouth that had never spoken a kind word. His 2 companions flanked him like hunting dogs, lean and predatory. "McBride." Beasley's voice boomed across the yard, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I know you got my property in there. Send them out and we'll be on our way." Eli positioned himself behind the water trough, using it as cover, while keeping his rifle trained on the 3 men. His heart was pounding, but his voice remained steady. "These children aren't your property. They're free to go where they please." Beasley's laugh was like gravel being shaken in a tin can. "Free, boy, you don't understand how this works. I invested good money in them brats, fed them, housed them, taught them useful skills. They're mine until I say otherwise, and I got the law on my side." "What law?" Eli shot back. "The law that says you can kidnap children and work them to death. The law that says a man's got a right to his property." Beasley replied, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "And the law that says interfering with a man's business is a hanging offense." From inside the house, Eli could hear the children's terrified whispers. Jesse was trying to calm the younger ones, but his own fear was evident in his voice. The sound of their terror made something primitive and violent stir in Eli's chest, the same protective instinct that had made him fight off coyotes when they threatened his chickens, the same rage that had consumed him when he'd found Samuel's body in the yard. "I'm giving you one chance to ride away." Eli called out his voice, carrying more confidence than he felt. These children are under my protection now. Beasley's expression shifted, and for a moment, something like respect flickered in his dead eyes. You got sand, I'll give you that. But sand don't stop bullets. He nodded to his companions. Boys, persuade the man to see reason. The first shot came without warning, shattering the window above Eli's head and sending a shower of glass cascading onto the porch. Inside the house, the children screamed in terror, and Eli could hear Jesse's voice trying to reassure them with the kind of maturity no 12-year-old should possess. The second shot splintered the door frame, sending splinters of wood flying like shrapnel. The third punched a hole through the metal water trough, and precious water began streaming onto the groundwater that Eli had collected drop by drop during the rare rain showers that had blessed the valley over the past year. Eli forced himself to breathe slowly, remembering the lessons his father had taught him about shooting under pressure. Panic made you miss, and missing got you killed. He rose slightly above the trough, found his target, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against his shoulder, and Beasley's scarred companion tumbled from his horse with a howl of pain, clutching his leg as blood seeped between his fingers. The man hit the ground hard, his rifle flying from his grasp to land several yards away. You son of a bitch. Beasley roared, his face flushing red with rage. You just signed your own death warrant. He turned to his remaining companion, the thin man who constantly chewed tobacco. Jake, burn them out. Jake reached into his saddlebag and produced a torch wrapped in oil-soaked cloth. The sight of it made Eli's stomach clench with dread. In this drought-stricken environment, fire was more dangerous than bullets. Jake lit the torch with a match and rode toward the barn, his horse prancing nervously as the flames danced just inches from its ears. The barn housed Eli's 2 remaining horses and most of his tools, everything he needed to survive in this harsh environment. But more importantly, it stood dangerously close to the house where the children were hiding. If the fire spread, they could all be trapped. Within minutes, the dry wood was ablaze, orange tongues licking hungrily at the roof, with the voracious appetite of a living thing. The fire spread with terrifying speed, fed by months of drought and the bone-dry timber that had been baking in the sun for years. The horses inside were screaming in terror, their cries almost human in their desperation. Thick smoke began to drift across the yard, carried by the hot wind that seemed to blow constantly in Dust Valley. The acrid smell stung Eli's eyes and made it difficult to breathe, and he could hear the children coughing inside the house as the choking haze began to seep through the cracks in the walls. Jesse. Eli called through the door, his voice hoarse from the smoke. I need your help, boy. The door cracked open, and Jesse's soot-streaked face appeared. Despite his youth, the boy had the kind of inner strength that came from taking responsibility for others from an early age. What do you need, sir? The horses, Eli said, pointing toward the blazing barn. We got to get them out before the whole structure collapses. Jesse nodded without hesitation, understanding instinctively that saving the horses meant preserving their only means of escape if the situation became impossible. Annie, he called back into the house, you're in charge. Keep everyone low and away from the windows. Together, Eli and Jesse ran toward the inferno, the heat hitting them like a physical wall as they approached the barn entrance. The interior was a hellscape of orange light and choking smoke, with burning hay falling from the loft like fiery snow. The horses were in a state of complete panic, their eyes rolling white as they reared and kicked at their stall doors. Eli threw open the first stall and grabbed the mare's halter, speaking to her in soothing tones as he led her toward the exit. Easy, girl. Easy now. We're going to get you out of here. Jesse worked on the second horse, a gelding that had been spooked beyond reason. The boys showed remarkable courage, dodging the animal's flailing hooves while working to calm it enough to lead it to safety. But the smoke was getting thicker, and the heat was becoming unbearable. Just as they were leading the second horse out, a burning beam crashed down from the ceiling, falling directly toward Jesse. Eli threw himself sideways, tackling the boy out of the way, and felt the searing agony as the beam glanced off his left shoulder. His shirt began to smolder, and he rolled frantically on the ground to extinguish the embers. Jesse had hit the ground hard, and for a moment, Eli thought the boy might be seriously injured. But Jesse pushed himself up, his face gray with exhaustion and smoke inhalation, and looked at Eli with concern rather than fear. "You're hurt," Jesse said, his voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "I'm fine." Eli lied, though his shoulder felt like it was on fire. "We need to get back to the house." They stumbled back toward the ranch house, the horses following behind them, with the desperate urgency of animals fleeing a predator. But as they reached the porch, Eli saw that their troubles were far from over. Sparks from the barn had caught the wooden shingles of the house, and small flames were beginning to lick at the edges of the roof. In the root cellar beneath the house, Eli had stored precious rainwater in wooden barrels, water he'd collected during the few storms that had blessed the valley over the past year. Each drop was more valuable than gold, but he used it now to douse the flames threatening their shelter. As he worked soaking rags in the precious water and beating at the flames, Eli became aware of something that made his blood freeze. Through the smoke and chaos, he could hear Annie's voice inside the house, and she was singing a soft, haunting melody that seemed strangely familiar. The tune stirred something deep in his memory, a fragment of his past that he'd thought buried forever. His wife Mary used to sing that same song while she worked in the kitchen, her voice carrying through the house like a gentle blessing. But how could this child know Mary's song? "Jesse," Eli called as the boy helped him stamp out the last of the roof fires. "That song Annie's singing, where did she learn it?" Jesse's face took on a strange expression. "That's Mama's song. She used to sing it to us when we were scared. Said it came from her sister back before the family broke apart." The words hit Eli like a physical blow, but before he could process their full meaning, Beasley's voice boomed across the yard once more. "You're just making this harder on yourself, McBride. Send out my property, and I'll make this quick." Eli peered through the smoke and saw that Beasley and his remaining companion had positioned themselves strategically. The wounded man was still on the ground, but he'd managed to retrieve his rifle and was using his horse as cover. They had the house surrounded, and the fire was getting worse by the minute. "Annie," Eli called through the door. "I need to see something." The girl appeared in the doorway, her face streaked with soot, but her blue eyes bright with determination. Around her neck, partially hidden by her torn dress, was a small silver locket that caught the light from the flames outside. Eli's heart stopped. Even through the smoke and chaos, he recognized that locket with the kind of certainty that comes from intimate familiarity. It was the locket he'd given to Mary on their wedding day 15 years ago. He'd saved for months to buy it, working extra jobs and going without meals to afford the delicate silver chain and the tiny compartment that held their wedding photograph. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Annie's fingers moved protectively to cover the locket. "It was my mama's. She said it came from her sister before she died. Said it was all she had left of her family." "Open it," Eli commanded, his hands shaking. With trembling fingers, Annie opened the locket. Inside was a photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, Mary, as she'd looked on their wedding day before. Grief and illness had aged her beyond her years. Below the photograph, engraved in delicate script that Eli remembered commissioning from the jeweler in town, were the words, "To my beloved Mary, from Eli." The world seemed to tilt around him, and for a moment, Eli felt like he was drowning in memories. The implications crashed over him like a tidal wave, rearranging everything he thought he knew about these children and their circumstances. "What was your mother's name?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Sarah." Annie whispered, her eyes searching his face for answers. "Sarah Whitmore. She told us stories about her sister Mary, how she married a rancher named Eli McBride and lived in a place called Dust Valley. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with devastating clarity. Sarah had been Mary's younger sister, and they'd had a bitter falling out 10 years ago. The memory came flooding back with painful intensity. Sarah had come to them desperate and pregnant, begging for money to help her husband start a legitimate business. She'd been married to a drifter named Tom Whitmore, a man with more charm than sense and a tendency to make promises he couldn't keep. Eli had refused to help, convinced that Tom would squander the money on gambling and drink. The argument had escalated until harsh words were spoken that could never be taken back. Sarah had accused Eli of being cold and selfish, while he'd called her husband a worthless dreamer who would drag the whole family down with him. "You'll regret this." Sarah had set her eyes bright with tears and fury. "When Mary realizes what kind of man she married, she'll see that blood means nothing to you." Sarah had left that night, taking with her Mary's hopes of reconciliation. The grief over the broken family relationship had contributed to Mary's decline, and Eli had blamed Sarah for hastening his wife's death. He'd never known that Sarah had children, never knew that his wife's bloodline continued through these 6 desperate souls. Now staring at these children, Mary's nieces and nephews, his own family, Eli felt something crack open inside his chest. The locket had been his wedding gift to Mary, and she'd apparently given it to Sarah as a peace offering, a bridge across the chasm that pride and stubbornness had created. "You're Mary's sister's children," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're my family." The children stared at him with a mixture of hope and confusion, not fully understanding what this revelation meant, but sensing its importance. Jesse stepped forward, his dark eyes intense with desperate hope. "You really are, Uncle?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "Yes," Eli said. And the word felt like a sacred oath, a promise that would bind him to these children for the rest of his life. "And I'm going to keep you safe. I swear it on your Aunt Mary's grave." The revelation transformed everything. His motivation shifted from mere human decency to blood-bound responsibility. These weren't random orphans he was helping out of pity. They were his family, his legacy, his chance to honor Mary's memory and make up for the years of bitter silence that had kept them apart. But the revelation also filled him with crushing guilt. If he'd swallowed his pride 10 years ago, if he'd helped Sarah when she asked, these children might have grown up knowing their aunt and uncle. They might have had a safe place to go when their parents died, instead of ending up in Beasley's clutches. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry about what happened to your mother, about the family being broken. If I'd known, it's not your fault," Annie said simply, her childish wisdom cutting through his guilt. "Mama always said that sometimes good people make bad choices when they're scared or hurt. She said the important thing was learning to forgive." Before Eli could respond, the sound of splintering wood made them all turn toward the barn. The structure was collapsing, sending a shower of sparks high into the air. Some of the burning debris landed on the house, and within moments, the wooden shingles were ablaze once more. The fire had spread to the main house now, and smoke was beginning to fill the interior. The children were coughing more frequently, and little Rose had developed a wheeze that spoke of serious smoke inhalation. They had to get out, but Beasley and his men were still out there waiting to reclaim their property. "We can't stay here," Eli said, his mind racing through their limited options. "The whole place is going to burn down." Jesse coughed violently, his young face gray with smoke inhalation. "What about the back window? It's small, but the little ones might fit." "Too risky," Eli replied. "Beasley's got us surrounded. The minute we show ourselves, he'll start shooting." As if summoned by his words, Beasley's voice boomed across the yard once more. "You got 5 minutes, McBride. After that, I'm coming in there to collect what's mine, and I don't care if the whole place burns down with you in it." Eli looked at the 6 young faces surrounding him, their eyes wide with terror, but also with absolute trust. They believed he could save them, just as Samuel had believed his father could protect him from the random violence that plagued their world. He'd failed Samuel. He wouldn't fail these children. "Listen to me," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We're going to get out of here, all of us. But I need you to do exactly what I say when I say it. Can you do that?" The children nodded in unison, their faces grave with understanding. Even little Rose seemed to grasp the seriousness of the situation. In her panic, Annie suddenly bolted for the back window, her fear overriding her common sense. "I can't breathe," she gasped, clawing at the window frame. "Annie, no." Jessie called out, but it was too late. She'd already climbed through the opening and dropped into the yard beyond. Her scream of terror cut through the roar of the fire like a knife through silk. Through the smoke-darkened window, Eli saw the nightmare scenario unfolding. Beasley had materialized from the haze like a demon from hell, his massive arm wrapped around Annie's small body, while his other hand held a knife to her throat. "I got one of them." Beasley's triumphant voice carried over the flames. "Now we're going to discuss terms." Eli's vision blurred with rage and desperation. The blade was so close to Annie's throat that he could see a thin line of blood where it had already broken the skin. Her eyes were wide with terror, but she was trying to be brave, trying not to give Beasley the satisfaction of seeing her complete fear. "You got 10 seconds to send out the others, McBride." Beasley called his voice, carrying the authority of someone who'd made good on similar threats before. "Or this little girl bleeds out right here in the dirt." Eli's ammunition was nearly exhausted, spent during the earlier firefight. The fire was creeping closer to the interior of the house, and the smoke was getting so thick that it was becoming difficult to see or breathe. The remaining children looked at him with desperate hope, believing he could perform miracles even in the face of impossible odds. 5 seconds. Beasley pressed the knife closer to Annie's throat, and more blood appeared on her pale skin. Eli closed his eyes and made his choice. He couldn't trade 5 children for one, but he also couldn't let Annie die while he had breath in his body. The revelation about their family connection had changed everything. And these weren't just random children he was protecting, they were his blood, his responsibility, his chance at redemption. "I'm coming out," he called through the smoke. "But I want to make a deal. The only deal is you send out my property and I don't kill all of you." Beasley replied, "They're not property." Eli said, his voice carrying across the yard with surprising strength. "They're my family. My dead wife's sister's children. That makes them my responsibility." There was a moment of silence, broken only by the crackling of the flames and Annie's terrified breathing. Then Beasley laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin can. "I'm family well, ain't that touching? Tell you what, Uncle, you come out with your hands up and I'll make sure she dies quick instead of slow." Eli soaked the remaining blankets in the last precious water from the root cellar, his hands moving with the desperate efficiency of a man who'd run out of options. The water was shockingly cold against their overheated skin, but it would provide only momentary protection against the inferno they had to cross. "Stay low and follow me," he commanded the 5 children who remained with him. "Don't breathe the smoke, it'll kill you faster than the flames. If anyone falls, keep moving. I'll come back for you." The first stage of their escape was pure nightmare. They crawled through the burning house like a chain of ghosts, each child holding tight to the one in front of them. The floorboards were beginning to buckle under their feet, and Eli could hear the support beams creaking ominously overhead. The heat was so intense that he felt his eyebrows singeing, and the smoke burned his lungs with every breath. Behind them, another section of the roof began to collapse, sending a shower of sparks and burning debris cascading down like hellish snow. Rose, the youngest, suddenly stumbled and cried out. The floorboard beneath her foot had given way, and her small leg was caught in the gap. Eli reached back and pulled her free, but the delay had cost them precious seconds. The flames were spreading faster now, racing along the walls with hungry efficiency. They reached the back door just as the main support beam in the front room gave way with a thunderous crash. The house shuddered like a wounded animal, and Eli knew they had only minutes before the entire structure collapsed. They burst through the door into the yard, gasping for clean air like drowning men reaching the surface. But there was no time to recover. The second stage of their ordeal was waiting. Beasley's companion, Jake, had positioned himself behind the stone foundation of the old smokehouse. Despite the wound in his leg, he'd managed to prop his rifle against the stones and was taking careful aim at the door they'd just emerged from. Eli, his left shoulder already burned and his body weakened by smoke inhalation, launched himself at the gunman with the desperate fury of a man protecting his family. They collided with bone-jarring force, and the rifle went off between them, and the bullet passing so close to Eli's head that he felt the heat of its passage. They rolled in the dirt, grappling for control of the weapon. Jake was younger and less injured, but Eli had the advantage of absolute desperation. He could hear the children behind him, their voices raised in terror as they watched their protector fight for his life. Jake's fingers found Eli's burned shoulder and squeezed, sending waves of agony through his nervous system. White spots danced in front of his eyes, and for a moment he thought he might pass out from the pain. But then he heard little Rose crying, and the sound gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. He brought his knee up hard into Jake's midsection, doubling the man over. As Jake gasped for breath, Eli managed to wrench the rifle away and put the barrel against his opponent's chest. "This is for what you did to these children," Eli said, and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across the yard, and Jake's eyes widened with surprise before going blank. He fell backward, his life bleeding out into the thirsty earth. But Eli's victory was short-lived. He turned to see the third and most brutal stage of their ordeal unfolding. Beasley still held Annie at the edge of the old well, the deep shaft that had been dug during better times but had run dry months ago. The fall would be fatal 30 feet down onto jagged rocks and broken timbers. "You killed both my men, you son of a bitch." Beasley snarled, his face twisted with rage and something that might have been respect. "Now you're gonna watch this little girl die for what you done." Eli's rifle was empty, and he was too far away to reach them before Beasley could cut Annie's throat or push her into the well. His shoulder was on fire, and blood was streaming down his arm from where Jake's fingers had reopened the burn. But he ran anyway, his wounded body screaming protests with every step. Annie was no longer passive in Beasley's grip. As Eli charged toward them, she suddenly twisted in the man's arms and sank her teeth into his wrist. Beasley howled and loosened his grip just enough for her to break free. But in his rage, Beasley lashed out with the knife, catching Annie across the arm as she tried to escape. She cried out and stumbled, and for a terrifying moment it seemed like she might fall into the well anyway. Eli reached them just as Beasley was raising the knife for another strike. He hit the larger man like a battering ram, driving his good shoulder into Beasley's midsection with all the force he could muster. The impact sent both men tumbling toward the edge of the well. They grappled on the crumbling stones, each trying to push the other over the precipice. Beasley was larger and stronger, but Eli had the advantage of absolute desperation. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting his family, about making up for all the years of bitterness and isolation. Beasley's hands found Eli's throat, and the world began to turn gray around the edges. Eli could hear the children screaming, could hear Jesse's voice calling his name, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. Just when it seemed like his strength would fail, Eli remembered Mary's voice the way she used to sing to him when he was troubled. He thought about the locket around Annie's neck, about the bridge that Mary had tried to build across the chasm of family pride. With his last reserves of strength, Eli brought his knee up hard into Beasley's groin. The man doubled over with a grunt of pain, his grip loosening just enough for Eli to break free. But they were both still dangerously close to the edge of the well. "You're gonna die here, old man." Beasley gasped, blood trickling from his mouth. "And then I'm going to take these brats and work them till they drop." "No," said a young voice from behind them. "You're not." The rifle shot echoed across the yard like thunder. Beasley's body jerked as the bullet took him in the chest, punching through his heart and spinning him around. He staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief, and toppled over the edge of the well. His scream echoed off the stone walls until it was cut short by a distant final thud. Eli turned, gasping for breath, and saw Jesse standing 20 feet away. The boy was holding the smoking rifle with hands that shook from the recoil, his young face pale but determined. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, but his grip on the weapon was steady. "I had to," Jesse said, his voice breaking. "He was gonna kill you, and then he was gonna hurt Annie again. I couldn't let that happen." Eli struggled to his feet and walked over to the boy, his own vision blurred with tears. "You did the right thing," he said, pulling Jesse into a fierce embrace. "You saved us all." The fourth and final stage of their ordeal began with the sound of approaching horses. For a moment, Eli thought more of Beasley's men had arrived, but then he heard a familiar voice calling his name. "Eli McBride, this is Sheriff Bradley." Sheriff Tom Bradley rode into the yard with 3 deputies drawn by the column of smoke that was visible for miles across the valley. Bradley was a lean man in his 50s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent dealing with the worst humanity had to offer. He took one look at the burning ranch, the dead men scattered around the yard, and the wounded children, and his expression hardened with understanding. "Beasley," he asked simply, "and all?" Eli managed swaying on his feet as shock and blood loss finally began to take their toll. "Bottom of the well." Bradley nodded grimly. "Good. We've been tracking him for 3 weeks. Found his last camp yesterday, 3 more dead children worked to death and thrown in a ravine like garbage." The children gathered around Eli as he collapsed to his knees, his strength finally giving out completely. Annie pressed against his uninjured side, her arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage torn from Jesse's shirt. The other children formed a protective circle around them, and their faces streaked with soot and tears, but their eyes bright with hope. "These are my family," Eli told the sheriff, his voice hoarse from smoke and emotion. "My wife's sister's children. I'm all they have left in this world." Bradley's expression softened as he looked at the orphaned children who'd found their way to their uncle through tragedy and violence. "We'll get you all to the doctor, every one of you. Doc Peterson's good with children. He'll fix you up proper." As the town doctor arrived and began treating their wounds, the children refused to leave Eli's side. They'd found something more precious than food or shelter. They'd found someone who would fight for them, who would risk everything to keep them safe. The doctor worked quickly, cleaning and bandaging Eli's burns while checking the children for signs of serious injury. Annie's knife wound was shallow, but would need stitches. Jesse had inhaled too much smoke and would need to rest for several days. The others were suffering from malnutrition and exhaustion, but nothing that proper food and care couldn't cure. The territorial governments put a substantial bounty on Beasley and his entire operation. Bradley explained as the doctor worked. $500 for Beasley himself, plus another $50 for each of his men. You'll have enough money to rebuild proper, maybe even expand. The townspeople who'd once viewed Eli as a strange hermit now saw him as a hero. Word spread quickly through Dust Valley about the rancher who'd taken on Beasley's entire gang to protect 6 orphaned children. Offers of help began pouring in from all directions. Men who'd never spoken to Eli before stepped forward to offer labor and materials for rebuilding, and women brought food and clothing for the children. Mrs. Henderson, whose family had left the valley 6 months earlier, returned with a wagon full of supplies. "Heard what you done," she said simply. "These children need a proper home, and we aim to help you give them one." Over the following weeks, as Eli recovered from his injuries and the children began to heal from their trauma, the full extent of their journey became clear. They'd walked over 100 miles during their escape, hiding by day, and traveling by night, living on berries and stream water. They'd shown remarkable courage and resourcefulness, but the ordeal had left deep scars. Tommy still flinched when adults raised their voices. Beth had nightmares about the mines waking up screaming about cave-ins and darkness. Carl had developed a stutter that came out when he was nervous. Little Rose clung to Annie constantly, as if afraid her big sister might disappear. But they were healing slowly, but surely. Jesse had taken on the role of protector with natural authority, but he was learning to be a child again, too. Annie's quick mind was evident in everything she did, and she showed a particular aptitude for reading and writing. The younger children were beginning to laugh again, to play, to trust. 6 months later, the transformation was complete. Eli stood in front of a new ranch house built with lumber donated by the community and constructed through the volunteer labor of neighbors who'd become friends. The structure was larger than the old one, with separate bedrooms for the children, and a kitchen spacious enough for a real family to gather comfortably. The new well, dug with the help of the town's best water witch, provided clean water even during the continuing drought. The barn was sturdier than its predecessor, built to withstand both fire and the harsh weather that plagued the valley. Most importantly, the house rang with the sound of children's laughter, a sound that had been absent from Eli's life for far too long. His physical wounds had healed, though his left shoulder would never regain its full strength, and the scars from the burns would remain with him forever. But those visible reminders of the battle seemed insignificant compared to the healing that had taken place inside him. Jesse had grown 4 inches and filled out considerably his face, losing the gaunt hollows of malnutrition. He'd proven to be a natural, with cattle and horses displaying the kind of instinctive understanding that couldn't be taught. The boy still carried the weight of having taken a life. But Eli had helped him understand that protecting innocent people sometimes required difficult choices. "You saved us all," Eli had told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "That takes courage, and courage is something to be proud of, not ashamed of." Annie had started school in town and was proving to be exceptionally bright, with a particular talent for mathematics that amazed her teachers. She'd kept the silver locket, but now she understood its full significance as a bridge between her dead mother and the uncle who'd become her guardian. Tommy had lost the haunted look that had marked him when they first arrived, and his stutter had gradually faded. He'd developed a passion for carpentry, spending hours in the workshop, helping to build furniture for their new home. The cut on his cheek had healed to leave only a faint scar, but the boy seemed proud of it, proof that he'd survived something terrible and come out stronger. Beth had revealed a talent for cooking that reminded Eli painfully of his late wife. She'd taken over much of the meal preparation with the serious dedication of someone who understood the value of a full stomach. Her nightmares had become less frequent, and she'd begun to smile again. Carl had shown an aptitude for numbers that suggested he might one day make a successful businessman. His nervous stutter had disappeared, entirely replaced by an eager curiosity about everything around him. He'd become the family's unofficial accountant, keeping track of their expenses and income with meticulous care. Little Rose had blossomed into a chatterbox, who filled the house with constant questions and observations. She'd grown several inches and gained the healthy roundness that came from regular meals and security. Her laughter was infectious, and she had a way of making everyone around her smile. But perhaps the most important healing had happened inside Eli himself. The anger and bitterness that had consumed him for years had been replaced by purpose and hope. He'd learned that second chances were possible, that love could grow from the ashes of loss, and that family could be created as well as inherited. As he prepared to call the children in for supper on this particular evening, Annie approached him with something clutched in her small hands. It was a bundle of yellowed letters tied with a faded ribbon that had once been blue. "We found these in Mama's things," she said quietly, her voice taking on the serious tone she used when dealing with adult matters. "She kept them hidden in her Bible, but we thought you should have them." Eli's hands shook as he accepted the bundle and untied the ribbon. The letters were from Mary, written to her sister over the years of their estrangement. And the handwriting was as familiar to him as his own. With growing amazement, he read his wife's words, pleas for forgiveness, expressions of love, and desperate attempts to bridge the gap that pride and stubbornness had created. The first letter was dated just after Sarah's departure, when the wound was still fresh and raw. My dearest Sarah, I cannot believe the harsh words that passed between us yesterday. Eli was wrong to refuse you, and I was wrong to let him speak to you that way. You are my sister, my blood, and nothing should come between us. Please write to me. Please let me know you're safe. The letters continued over the years, each one a little more desperate than the last. Mary had written about her declining health, about her fears for the future, about her longing to see her sister's children. She'd poured out her heart on paper, creating a record of love that had never been allowed to flourish. The final letter, written just weeks before Mary's death, contained a passage that made Eli's throat close with emotion. Dearest Sarah, I know I may never see you again in this world, but I want you to know that I forgive you for everything that passed between us. More than that, I want you to forgive me for the harsh words I spoke in anger and for allowing pride to keep our families apart. If something happens to me, I pray that Eli will find it in his heart to do the same. He's a good man, but he's been hurt so deeply that he's forgotten how to love without fear. Your children might be the key to healing him, just as they could heal the wounds in your own heart. Love is stronger than pride, Sarah. Please remember that when the time comes. The revelation hit Eli like a physical blow. Mary had seen the future with the clarity that sometimes comes to those facing death. And she'd tried to prepare the way for reconciliation. The children hadn't just been hungry for food when they'd appeared at his door, they'd been hungry for family, for belonging. For the very thing he'd been denying himself for years. Sarah had apparently treasured these letters, keeping them as a reminder of the sister she'd lost. The children had found them after their mother's death and had carried them during their escape from Beasley's camp, not fully understanding their significance, but knowing they were important. Your mother kept these all these years? Eli said, his voice thick with emotion. She never stopped loving her sister, even when they couldn't be together. She used to read them to us sometimes, Annie said softly. When she was sad or scared, she'd tell us about Aunt Mary and how much she wished we could meet her. As the sun set over Dust Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Eli called his family to dinner. They gathered around the large wooden table he'd built with his own hands, Jesse and Annie Tommy, and Beth Carl, and little Rose, 6 children, who changed his life with a simple question asked in desperation. Can we have your leftovers? The dining room filled with the warm sounds of conversation and laughter as they shared their evening meal. Jesse told stories about his day, working with the cattle, his voice filled with the pride of someone who'd found his calling. Annie shared what she'd learned in school, her enthusiasm for knowledge, evident in every word. Tommy described the cabinet he was building, his hands moving, as he explained the joinery techniques he'd mastered. Beth presented the evening's dessert, an apple pie made from fruit she'd traded with a neighbor, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd learned to find joy in nurturing others. Carl calculated how much money they'd saved by growing their own vegetables, his young mind already grasping the importance of thrift and planning. Little Rose chattered about her day's adventures, her innocent observations bringing smiles to everyone's faces. As they lingered over their meal, Eli found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them all together. The violence and terror of that day 6 months ago seemed like a nightmare from another lifetime. But the scars remained as reminders of how precious their current happiness truly was. Uncle Eli, Rose said suddenly, her small voice cutting through the comfortable conversation. Are you glad we came to ask for your leftovers? Eli looked around the table at the 6 faces that had become the center of his world. These children had saved him as much as he'd saved them, pulling him back from the brink of a loneliness that would have eventually consumed him entirely. "Yes, little one," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm gladder than you'll ever know." As the evening wound down and the children prepared for bed, Eli stepped out onto the porch of his new home. The stars were brilliant in the clear desert sky, and the air carried the scent of sage and the promise of rain. Dust Valley was still a harsh place, still a land where survival required strength and determination, but it no longer felt like a prison. He thought about Mary, about the letters she'd written and the love she'd refused to let die. He thought about Samuel, about the boy who'd been taken too soon, but whose memory no longer brought only pain. Most of all, he thought about the 6 children sleeping safely in their beds, about the future they would build together, and about the family they'd created from the ashes of loss and the courage to love again. The sound of quiet laughter drifted from the house as the older children helped settle the younger ones for the night, and Eli smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and new opportunities to build something lasting. But tonight, in the house that love had built, all was well in Dust Valley. As he turned to go back inside, Eli cast one last look at the stars wheeling overhead. Somewhere among them, he believed Mary was watching and smiling. The broken family she'd mourned had been made whole again, and the legacy of love she'd left behind had triumphed over pride, pain, and the passage of time. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the house settled into the peaceful quiet of a family at rest. In the morning, there would be work to do, lessons to learn, and a future to build together. But tonight, surrounded by the laughter and love of the children who'd asked for his leftovers, and found a father instead, Eli McBride was finally truly home.